The world's still dark when Magnus Jackson wakes. Not the kind of dark that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels heavy, like the air itself hasn't made up its mind about letting the sun in. His alarm doesn't ring anymore. It hasn't for years. He just wakes, the way men do when life has trained them to never be late, not even to pain. He sits at the edge of the bed, hands pressed against his knees, the slow kind of breathing that comes from decades of discipline. His room smells faintly of soap and metal, the scent of work that never quite washes off. The walls are bare except for a single framed photo of his son, Daniel, smiling in his graduation gown. Magnus bought that frame from a dollar store the same day he paid off his son's student loan. He ties his boots tight. Not new boots. Not clean either. Just steady. Like him. Everything he owns tells a quiet story about use and endurance. Before we go further, where are you watching from? And tell me, have you ever worked so hard just to be unseen? Magnus Jackson, 62, born and raised in Tennessee, learned early that life doesn't hand out favors. His father was a truck driver who smelled of diesel and winter wind. His mother scrubbed floors in other people's homes, her knees worn down by tile and time. They didn't talk much about dreams, only duty. In his house, love sounded like, "Did you eat?" and faith looked like showing up again tomorrow. Magnus never went to college. Not because he didn't want to, but because somebody had to keep the lights on. He started working at 17, fixing machines in a factory that went through workers the way fire eats paper. 45 years later, he's still there, still showing up, still holding everything together with calloused hands and quiet resolve. People at work respect him, though they don't always see him. He's the man who covers other people's shifts. The man who stays late when things break down. The man who doesn't complain. They call him old school, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with pity. He calls it being raised right. He saves every dollar, though there's not much left to save. Half his paycheck goes to the house he's nearly finished paying off, the same small house where Daniel grew up. The rest goes to whatever his son needs. Daniel never asked, not directly, but Magnus always knew. Tuition. Car repairs. Wedding deposits. A father doesn't wait for his child to ask. He just gives quietly the way his own father did. Magnus doesn't drink much. Doesn't go out. His joy comes in smaller shapes. The smell of fresh laundry, the hum of an engine running smooth, a phone call from his boy even if it's just 2 minutes long. Daniel calls him Pop, still though less often now. The world Daniel lives in speaks a different language. One of wine tastings, company retreats, and polished people who've never known what it feels like to sweat through your shirt before noon. Magnus never says it, but sometimes when Daniel talks he can feel the distance. The words are polite, the tone respectful, but there's something else underneath, the kind of careful that sounds like shame. Magnus catches it in Daniel's pauses, the way he says, "We'll talk later," when he's around his fiancée, Emily. It's not anger that Magnus feels, not even sadness. Just a quiet kind of ache, the kind that doesn't hurt loud, it just lingers. Every morning, Magnus tells himself that maybe Daniel just needs time. Maybe he's building something new, something better. Maybe that's what all this work was for, to give his son a life where he could forget what struggle felt like. But some mornings, when the silence in the house feels too big, he wonders if he built that comfort at the cost of being remembered. At work, Magnus doesn't talk about his family. The younger men talk about bonuses, weekend trips, new phones. He listens, smiles a little, then goes back to tightening bolts and checking gauges. His body moves like a metronome, steady, measured, almost holy in its precision. He's not the fastest anymore, but no one does it cleaner. He's the kind of man who believes that if you take care of the small things, the big things somehow take care of themselves. At lunch, he eats from the same tin lunchbox his mother gave him before she died. Ham sandwich, apple, black coffee. Always the same. Habit is its own kind of comfort. Sometimes, when he eats alone in the break room, he thinks about what his father used to say, "The world don't owe you applause, son. Just pay you your due and keep on moving." And Magnus has kept moving. Through layoffs and sickness, through bills and quiet birthdays, through long nights that stretch into dawn. His hands have built more than machines. They built a life, modest, solid, unremarkable maybe, but his. He doesn't talk about it, but he's proud. Not of what he owns, but of what he's endured. He knows what it means to carry a family without asking for thanks. He knows the kind of silence that comes with sacrifice. But lately something feels different. Not wrong exactly, but off, like a song played a little out of tune. Daniel's wedding is coming up. Magnus has written every check, signed every form, nodded through every plan that wasn't his. He tells himself it's what fathers do. But some nights, as he stares at the receipts spread across his kitchen table, he feels a faint pulse of unease. He brushes it off. Love costs. Always has. And if his son's happiness is the price, he'll pay it 1,000 times over. Still, when he looks at that graduation photo, the smile, the pride, the boy who once called him, the best man I know, he can't help but wonder when that stopped being true. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the calm and the patience, something small begins to stir. Not anger. Not yet. But the first tremor of something that's been buried too long. The weight of work, after all, doesn't just build strength. Sometimes it builds silence. And silence, if held too long, can become the sound of a man disappearing. There are some absences that never quiet down. They don't scream, they don't weep, they just hum softly beneath everything you do, like a fridge that never stops running. Magnus lives with one of those absences. Her name is Diane. He doesn't talk about her much. When people at work mention their wives, he smiles, nods, and says, "Yeah, she was a good one." Then he changes the subject. They take it as grief. It isn't. It's habit. The muscle memory of someone who learned long ago that some stories don't deserve a second telling. Diane used to fill a room without even trying. The kind of woman whose laughter could make a grocery store aisle feel like Sunday morning. She had hands that always smelled of lemon soap and peppermint lotion, and eyes that looked at Magnus like he was more than a man with rough hands and work boots. She used to tell him, "You're steady, that's what I love about you." Back then, steady sounded like a compliment. Later it sounded like a cage. Their marriage began the way small-town love often does, with hope that felt bigger than the world. Two people who believed they could build something lasting if they worked hard enough. And for a while they did. A small house, a child, laughter that came easy. Diane wanted to open a daycare. Magnus promised to save for it. But savings take time, and dreams that wait too long can start to sour. He never saw the day she began to leave. It didn't happen in one argument or one night. It was a slow vanishing. Her side of the bed stayed cold longer. Her voice went quieter. One day her lipstick disappeared from the bathroom counter, then her shoes, then her favorite coffee mug. When Magnus noticed, she was already halfway gone. He didn't chase her. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to fight something he couldn't see. Diane didn't leave a note, just a folded grocery list on the kitchen table and a silence that never ended. Years later, when Daniel asked what happened, Magnus said, "Your mama needed something the world couldn't give her." The boy nodded like he understood, but he didn't. No one really could. In truth, Diane left the same way she lived, gently, almost politely. There were no slammed doors, no broken plates, no final speeches. Just one day she wasn't there to make breakfast, and the next day she wasn't there to say goodnight. Magnus kept her picture in a drawer he never opened. A small act of loyalty to something that used to be real. Raising Daniel alone became his new purpose. He didn't think of it as sacrifice, only survival. Every morning he made oatmeal, packed lunches, ironed uniforms. When Daniel was sick, Magnus stayed home from work and risked his pay. When Daniel needed braces, he worked extra shifts until his back screamed. He never complained. Fathers like him don't. Their bond was quiet but strong. Daniel used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while Magnus cooked dinner, the smell of stew and cornbread filling the room. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The boy's eyes would lift every so often, meeting his father's as if to make sure he was still there. Magnus always was. In school, Daniel was bright, quick-tongued, and curious. Teachers called him sharp. Magnus called him blessed. He went to every parent-teacher meeting, even when he was the only man in the room. The mothers looked at him with a mix of pity and respect, a man doing a woman's job as they saw it. Magnus ignored the looks. He didn't see it as a woman's job. He saw it as his. As Daniel grew older, the world began to notice the absence of Diane more than Magnus did. At birthdays, other kids asked where his mama was. Daniel said, "She's just away for a while." Magnus never corrected him. Truth can wait until hearts are strong enough to bear it. He tried dating once or twice, but it never took. Every woman compared herself to a ghost she didn't know. One told him, "You still look for her in every room." He didn't deny it. Because she was right. Even after years passed, Magnus couldn't bring himself to clear out Diane's side of the closet. The hangers stayed empty like open hands. Sometimes when he folded laundry, he'd find one of her old shirts, soft, faded, smelling faintly of mint. He'd hold it for a second, then fold it neatly and put it back where it came from. It wasn't grief anymore. It was ritual. Daniel became the reason he woke up each morning. The boy's laughter was medicine. His ambition was fuel. When Daniel said he wanted to go to college, Magnus didn't blink. He said, "Then that's what we'll do." Even when money was tight, he made it happen. He took extra jobs, fixed fences, repaired neighbors' sinks, anything to keep the dream alive. They never talked about Diane. Not once. But sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Magnus would catch Daniel looking at the photo on the mantel, the one of the three of them at the fair before she left. Daniel never asked to take it down. Magnus never offered. It became their unspoken truce. As Daniel became a man, Magnus started seeing pieces of Diane in him, the way he tilted his head when he thought, the way his eyes softened before saying something kind. It hurt, but it also healed. Maybe he thought that was her way of never really leaving. There were nights when Magnus sat on the porch, listening to cicadas hum through the heat, and wondered what she'd think if she saw them now. Would she be proud? Would she regret it? He'd never know. He stopped trying to. Some questions deserve to stay unanswered. They keep the heart from reopening old wounds. Still, when the nights got too quiet, he'd sometimes find himself talking to the air. Simple things. You'd be proud of him, D. He got that job you wanted him to. He's doing good. The silence always answered back, kind and merciless. Magnus built his life around what was left. Work, fatherhood, faith. He told himself that losing Diane wasn't a failure, it was the price of love given freely. And though he never said it out loud, part of him still loved her, not for what she was, but for the years when she made him feel seen. He learned to live with the echo. The sound of footsteps that never return. The weight of promises that turn to dust. But even in that emptiness, Magnus carried something beautiful. The proof that love, even when it breaks, still leaves enough light to raise a child by. And that's what he did. Alone, steady, and unseen. Because some men don't need witnesses. They just need to keep going. Magnus never meant to find the folder. It had been there for years, tucked deep in the bottom drawer of his old desk, the one that groaned when opened. He'd forgotten most of what was inside: tax papers, birth certificates, warranty slips for things that no longer worked. But that morning, looking for Daniel's college records, his hand brushed something he didn't remember. A slim red folder, faintly creased, edges softened with time. It wasn't labeled. Just plain old and quiet. He hesitated before opening it. Some part of him, the same part that avoided Diane's drawer all these years, whispered don't. But curiosity has a way of undoing even the most disciplined hearts. He flipped the latch. Inside were two envelopes, sealed but yellowed with age. The first bore his name in Diane's looping handwriting. The second, smaller, was marked for Daniel, when the time is right. Magnus sat back. The air around him seemed to shift. He traced her handwriting with a calloused thumb, feeling the shape of each letter like a bruise pressed gently. Then he unfolded the first envelope. The letter began with apology, the kind that already knows forgiveness won't come. Magnus, if you're reading this, then you've probably been angry at me, or maybe you've already stopped being angry. I don't know what's worse. I didn't leave to hurt you. I left because staying meant lying every day, and I was already drowning in lies. His hand trembled slightly. He read on. Daniel, he's not yours by blood. He was born from something I can't undo, and I won't justify it. It happened when you were working those long shifts. I was lonely. I was weak. Michael was there. He listened when I couldn't breathe under the weight of everything we wanted but never reached. I thought it was harmless at first, just words. But words turned into nights. Nights turned into Daniel. Magnus stopped breathing. The paper rustled faintly between his fingers. Michael. He knew that name too well, his oldest friend. The man who'd helped them move into this house. The man who toasted their wedding, who fixed the leaky sink when Magnus couldn't get off work. Michael, whose wife Elaine had always been too polite, too still, as if she carried secrets of her own. He forced himself to keep reading. Elaine found out before you did. She forgave him, or said she did, but she couldn't look at me again. I tried to end it. I tried to walk away from the shame, but then I realized walking away meant walking away from you too. You didn't deserve that. You never did. He could almost hear her voice, soft, ashamed, trembling on the edge of confession. You raised Daniel like he was your own, and in every way that matters, he is. He has your steadiness, your patience, your stubborn kind of love. Please don't tell him the truth. Let him keep believing. He deserves a clean story, not the mess we made of ours. I know you'll hate me for asking this. But if you can, love him as if nothing's changed. Because the only thing that should never change is how much he needs you. It ended there. No signature, no goodbye, just her name scribbled faintly in the corner, as if she'd run out of courage mid-sentence. Magnus sat still for a long time. The sound of the wall clock filled the silence, a steady, cruel rhythm. He thought of Daniel's face as a baby, the way his tiny hand once wrapped around Magnus' finger. He thought of all the nights he'd rocked him to sleep, the scraped knees, the laughter, the tears. None of it felt false. None of it could be undone by ink and paper. Still, the betrayal hit like cold water. His chest burned, not with rage but with something worse, grief for a truth that should have stayed buried. He looked at the second envelope, the one for Daniel. He turned it over in his hand, reading the faded instruction again. When the time is right. What time could ever be right for this? He placed both letters on the table. Then he stood up, walked to the window and stared out at the yard. The sun was climbing, turning the morning gold. Daniel's old bicycle still leaned against the fence, rust blooming on the chain. The swing they built together creaked in the wind. Every piece of that yard carried fingerprints of a life that wasn't built on blood, but on love. And love, Magnus decided, didn't need a pedigree. He walked back to the desk, sat down and read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word settle. There was no anger left. Just a dull ache that felt like understanding. He thought about Michael, where he might be now. He'd moved away years ago after Elaine's death. Magnus hadn't spoken to him since. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe that was fate sparing them both. Magnus took the letters, slid them back into the red folder and closed it carefully. Then he placed it in the drawer again, the same way he'd found it. Only this time he locked the drawer. He told himself it wasn't deceit. It was protection. When Daniel came by that evening, tall and confident in his college jacket, Magnus greeted him like always, with a clap on the shoulder and a quiet, proud smile. They ate dinner together, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a simple meal they'd shared 1,000 times before. Daniel talked about a new project, about maybe moving out soon, getting his own place. Magnus listened, nodding, memorizing every word. For a moment he almost told him. Almost. But then Daniel laughed, that easy, warm laugh that filled the room the way Diane's once had, and Magnus couldn't do it. What would truth serve now, except to shatter what love had held together all these years? So he swallowed it. All of it. That night, after Daniel left, Magnus sat alone at the kitchen table, the smell of dinner still hanging in the air. He stared at the empty plate across from him and whispered softly, "You'll never know, son. Not from me." He reached for Diane's photo from the drawer, the one he never opened, and placed it beside him. "You broke me," he said quietly, "but you gave me him. So maybe that's enough." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The house creaked softly like an old friend listening. Magnus leaned back, eyes tired but calm. Love, he thought, wasn't about who you share blood with. It was about who you choose to stay for, even when everything else has left. He'd chosen. And he would keep choosing. Until the end. Magnus didn't notice the distance at first. It didn't happen with slammed doors or bitter words. It crept in softly like fog. One missed call turned into two. One dinner postponed became weeks of, "I'll stop by soon, Pops." Before long, Daniel's voice existed mostly through speakers. Polished, hurried, and somehow foreign. The boy who once ran through the yard barefoot now wore pressed suits and spoke in tones shaped by boardrooms and dinner parties. Magnus couldn't blame him. That was the dream, wasn't it? To see his son climb higher, to escape the noise and grind Magnus himself had never escaped. But pride has a twin, loneliness, and Magnus was beginning to learn how sharp its edges could be. Daniel had moved to Nashville 2 years ago. A new job at a firm run by one of the Long families. Old black Tennessee money, people whose names carried weight in places Magnus had only ever seen on TV. When Daniel called, his voice carried the hum of that new world. Smooth, confident, full of plans and appointments. "Yeah, Pops, the company's expanding," Daniel said one evening over the phone. "They're flying me to Atlanta next week. Big presentation." Magnus smiled into the receiver. "That's good, son. Real good." He could hear clinking glasses in the background, music, laughter. "You celebrating?" he asked. "Just a small thing," Daniel said. "Colleagues, you know. You'd like them, sharp people." Magnus nodded, though Daniel couldn't see it. "I'm proud of you." There was a pause, the kind that used to be filled with easy talk but now just lingered. "Thanks, Pops. Listen, I'll call you Sunday, all right?" "Sure thing," Magnus said, but Sunday came and went. It wasn't neglect. It was something gentler, and somehow worse. Daniel loved him, Magnus knew that. But love changes shape when the world starts rewarding you for forgetting where you came from. When Daniel finally visited, he arrived in a car Magnus didn't recognize. Sleek, silver, smelling like leather and ambition. He stepped out wearing a jacket that looked like it cost more than Magnus' truck. "Pops," he said, smiling wide. "You look good." Magnus wiped his hands on a rag. "You too. Look at you, city man now." They hugged, Brief, polite, careful not to wrinkle anything. Magnus noticed how Daniel's cologne lingered in the air, strong and expensive. Inside, over coffee, Daniel talked about work, travel, the people he met. His sentences were filled with names Magnus didn't know. Clients, investors, friends with degrees and titles. Magnus listened, nodding, letting the pride and ache twist quietly together in his chest. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. Twice. 3 times. You can get that, Magnus said. No, it's fine, Daniel said, silencing it quickly. Just work stuff. But the way his eyes flicked down betrayed him. Magnus smiled faintly. You're busy? That's all right. Daniel leaned forward. No, I'm not too busy for you, Pops. You know that. Magnus nodded again. Sure. But later, when Daniel excused himself to take a call outside, Magnus watched through the window, saw him pacing by the truck, laughing, gesturing with that same confidence that never needed to ask permission. And for a moment, Magnus saw what everyone else saw. A man who belonged to a world far removed from the one that raised him. When Daniel left that evening, he promised to visit again soon. The words were smooth like they'd been practiced. Magnus stood on the porch long after the car disappeared down the road. The night settled around him, quiet, familiar, heavy. He looked at the house. The paint was peeling. The yard needed mowing. But it was home, the kind built with sweat and long hours, the kind that didn't make it onto real estate ads but carried the weight of every memory that mattered. He walked inside and saw Daniel's empty cup on the table. He didn't move it for a while. Magnus turned on the TV for company, flipping through channels without seeing anything. The commercials all showed smiling people with perfect homes and perfect lives. People who spoke like Daniel now did. He wondered when that happened, when success started to sound like a new language, one he couldn't quite understand. That weekend he went to the church fish fry. People asked about Daniel. Boy's doing real good, Magnus said, forcing a proud grin. Moved up in the world. That's something, one of the men said. You raised him right. Magnus nodded. Tried to. But later, driving home alone, those words echoed. Tried to. He thought about Diane again, her laughter, her mistakes, the letter he'd hidden away. Maybe this was how distance always begins, not with anger but with silence. Maybe love between father and son was like a rope, pulled tight across years, fraying in small places but never snapping completely. Magnus still sent Daniel messages, short ones. Proud of you, son. Saw your firm in the paper. Take care of yourself. Sometimes Daniel replied. Sometimes he didn't. And every time Magnus checked his phone and saw nothing new, he told himself it was fine. That's what fathers do, they wait. They understand. But understanding doesn't fill a quiet house. One night, Daniel called unexpectedly. Hey Pops, he said, his voice warm. Listen, we're hosting a dinner next week. You should come. Emily's parents are gonna be there. I told them all about you. Emily? Magnus asked. Yeah, the girl I told you about. We've been seeing each other for a while now. Magnus smiled. I'd like that. I'd like to meet her. And for the first time in a long while, his heart felt lighter. Maybe this was a way back in, a chance to bridge what time and class had quietly split apart. But as the call ended, Magnus sat there looking around the small living room, the faded curtains, the old photographs, and he wondered how much of him Daniel still saw when he looked his way. He stood, stretched, and went to wash the dishes. The cup Daniel used still sat by the sink. Magnus rinsed it, dried it, and placed it carefully in the cabinet, same spot as always. He whispered softly, almost to himself, You did good, boy. You did real good. Then he turned off the lights, the house sinking into stillness again. Pride and pain sitting side by side. Both of them proof that he had loved deeply enough to be left behind. Magnus arrived early like he always did. He parked his truck a block away from the Reeds' home, just to have a moment to collect himself. The street shimmered under soft Tennessee evening light, big porches, trimmed hedges, and brick homes that looked like they'd never known a broken thing in their life. He looked down at his shirt, freshly pressed, collar stiff, clean. His shoes, though old, were shined to a quiet dignity. He'd ironed for almost an hour before leaving, wanting to look right, wanting to make a good impression. Daniel had sounded excited. You'll love them, Pops, they're real good people. Magnus smiled at that. Real good people. He hoped so. When he finally reached the Reeds' front door, he could already hear laughter inside, smooth, practiced laughter, the kind that fills big rooms with confidence. He pressed the doorbell and waited. It was Emily who opened it. Mr. Jackson, she said, her tone bright and polite. So good to finally meet you. She was beautiful, elegant in a way that looked effortless. Her dress was subtle but expensive, her smile soft but measured. Magnus extended his hand, and she shook it lightly as though careful not to smudge the polish on her nails. "Thank you for having me," he said. "Of course," she replied. "Come on in. Daniel's just helping my mom in the kitchen." The house was something else. White walls, framed degrees, portraits of family members in military uniforms and black and white photos of country clubs and universities. A home built on legacy. The kind of place that said, "We've been somebody for a long time." Judge Robert Reed entered the room next, tall, silver hair, posture perfect. His handshake was firm but brief. "Mr. Jackson," he said with a nod. "Daniel's told us a lot about you. You work in facilities management, right?" Magnus smiled. "Yes, sir. Maintenance over at the plant. Been there 20 years. "Ah," the judge said, his voice smooth. "That's solid work. Hard work. We need more men like you around." The way he said it, "men like you," landed heavy. Before Magnus could respond, Josephine Reed appeared. She was striking, her presence commanding in a quiet way. Her jewelry gleamed under the chandelier light, and her smile, though polite, never reached her eyes. "Magnus Jackson," she said, drawing out each syllable. "It's a pleasure." "The pleasure's mine, ma'am." "Please sit," she said, motioning toward the long dining table already set for 6. "We've heard so much about you. Daniel's told us you raised him all by yourself." Magnus nodded. "Did my best." "That's admirable," she said. "Truly, it takes a strong man to do that. Especially with limited resources." There it was. Polite condescension, dressed up like a compliment. Emily smiled at her mother, then turned back to Magnus. "Daddy went to Howard. Mama went to Spelman. I went to Yale. Daniel's told you, right?" Magnus nodded again. "He did. Y'all worked hard for that. That's something to be proud of." Emily's father chuckled lightly. "We believe education changes how people see themselves, and how the world sees them." "Suppose so," Magnus said quietly. Dinner was served: roasted duck, mashed sweet potatoes with pecans, collard greens that didn't taste like they'd ever met smoke or seasoning. The conversation flowed easily between the Reeds and Daniel, talk of investments, policy, and upcoming charity galas. Magnus mostly listened. He felt the space between them, not just money but something deeper. The Reeds spoke about community uplift, but their idea of community stopped where their circle began. They were black, yes, but their blackness had been polished down, smoothed into something presentable for boardrooms and brunches. Magnus recognized that kind of pride, the kind that forgets the people who still work in overalls. At one point, Judge Reed leaned back and asked, "So, Mr. Jackson, what was your upbringing like? Your people from around here?" "Yes, sir. Born and raised right here in Tennessee. My folks worked hard." "Not much to it." Josephine sipped her wine. "And you stayed?" "Most people with ambition tend to leave." Magnus smiled faintly. "Some of us stay to keep the lights on." The table went quiet for half a beat, not long enough to be awkward but long enough for everyone to notice. Daniel laughed softly, trying to smooth it over. "Pops has jokes," he said, though his eyes flickered with something like embarrassment. Emily changed the subject to the wedding. Plans, venues, flowers. Magnus tried to follow along, but it all sounded expensive, custom, imported, exclusive. Words that didn't belong to his world. When dessert came, Josephine leaned forward with a smile that was too sharp. "So, Mr. Jackson, will you be contributing to the wedding? We know how much it means for parents to be involved." Magnus nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll do what I can." "That's wonderful," she said. "We're just so glad Daniel has someone like you in his life, steady, dependable. He's got so much potential and Emily's future is bright. It's important they start strong." Magnus looked at his son. Daniel's expression was tight, polite smile, eyes darting between him and the Reeds. He looked like a man caught between two languages he didn't know how to translate. When dinner ended, Magnus stood to leave. Emily thanked him for coming, her voice kind but distant. Judge Reed shook his hand again, a touch firmer this time, like sealing an unspoken understanding. Outside, the night air felt cleaner. Magnus took a deep breath, staring at the Reeds' big house. The columns, the cars, the glowing porch light. It was beautiful, sure, but it felt cold. He thought about Daniel, about how far he'd come, how proud he was, and how easy it was for pride to turn into something else. As Magnus walked back to his truck, he caught a glimpse of himself in the side mirror. Old shirt. Calloused hands. A man who worked, gave and kept giving. He whispered under his breath, "Men like me, huh?" He started the engine. The headlights washed over the Reeds' manicured lawn before cutting away into the dark. On the drive home, Magnus didn't feel angry, just small. Not because of what they had, but because of what they made him feel like he wasn't. He had always believed dignity came from work, not wealth. But sitting at that table he realized there are people, even in his own community, who still measure worth by the shine of your shoes and the softness of your voice. And for the first time the thought crept in quietly, painful and clear. Maybe love wasn't enough to bridge that kind of distance anymore. It started small. A few phone calls, polite messages, talks about colors and venues. Nothing too heavy at first. But weddings have a way of growing roots fast, especially when money and image are part of the soil. Emily's family had a vision. Not just a wedding but a statement. The Reed's daughter marrying a promising young professional from Tennessee. It needed to look right, feel right, sound right. Every flower, every plate, every photo would whisper the same thing. Legacy meets success. Magnus didn't mind helping. He was proud that his boy had found love, proud that Daniel wanted him there. At least that's what he thought. The first time the question came it was casual. "Magnus," Josephine said over the phone, her tone honeyed and precise. "We've been looking at venues, and Daniel mentioned you might be willing to cover part of the cost?" Magnus smiled. "Of course. I'll help where I can." "That's so generous," she replied. "We found this lovely vineyard just outside Nashville. It's exclusive but they offered us a wonderful deal." "How much are we talking?" Magnus asked. "Oh, just a deposit, $2,500. It'll secure the date." Magnus hesitated. That was a lot for him but he didn't let it show. "All right," he said softly. "I'll take care of it." "You're such a blessing," Josephine said, her voice smooth as silk. "Truly. You're honoring Daniel in the best way." That word, honoring, kept coming back. It showed up again when the florist called saying, "Mrs. Reed told me to reach out to you for payment." And again when the band sent him an invoice marked pending confirmation from the groom's father. By the third week, Magnus' savings account looked thinner than it had in years. Every transaction was a reminder that he was giving, pouring, stretching. All for a day that didn't seem to have a place for him beyond the receipts. He never complained. Love, after all, is loudest in the quiet ways you show up. One evening he called Daniel. "Hey son, I got another invoice today." "Something about the catering?" Daniel sounded distracted. "Yeah, Pops, sorry, they probably just copied your email from the deposit list. Emily's mom's handling most of that." Magnus chuckled softly. "Handling's one word for it." Daniel laughed too, but it was nervous. "She's just really organized, you know? Wants everything perfect." "I get it," Magnus said. "You happy?" "Yeah," Daniel answered. "I am." "That's all that matters then." Magnus hung up with a smile, but it faded quick. The word handling stuck with him. He wasn't being included, just used. And the difference between the two was starting to sting. As weeks passed, the meetings grew frequent. Zoom calls, spreadsheets, color swatches. Magnus tried to keep up, but every time he spoke, his words floated past them like background noise. "Daniel's father, yes," Josephine would say to vendors, cutting him off gently. "We'll take it from here." When he did speak, they smiled politely, their eyes already somewhere else. At one dinner meeting, Josephine said, "We want the ceremony to reflect both families, of course. But since we're handling most of the coordination, we'll just make sure your side feels represented." Magnus raised an eyebrow. "My side?" "Well, yes," she said. "We thought you might like to contribute something traditional, maybe a family blessing, or perhaps you'd like to sponsor the band?" Magnus smiled thinly. "Seems like I already have." The table laughed politely, not realizing it wasn't a joke. By midsummer, the bills stacked higher. Florists, musicians, decorators. A wedding planner who spoke to Magnus like he was part of the staff, not the family. He found himself double-checking his balance late at night, sitting in the glow of his old lamp. The numbers kept shrinking, but he kept telling himself it was worth it, that this was his son's moment, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by, all smiles and good energy. "Pops, you've done so much," he said, clapping Magnus on the shoulder. "We couldn't have pulled this off without you." Magnus smiled. "Just happy to help." "Emily's parents really appreciate it too," Daniel added. "They said you've been amazing through all this." "That right?" "Yeah. They think you're solid. Dependable." Magnus nodded, hiding the flicker in his chest. Dependable. Not respected. Not valued. Just dependable. He looked at his son, the suit, the polished watch, the ease with which he said those words, and wondered if Daniel could see it too. The difference between gratitude and pity. When Daniel left, Magnus sat in silence. On the table were envelopes and notes from the planner. He flipped through them one by one, until he reached a handwritten note from Josephine. "Thank you again for your generosity. It means so much that you're honoring Daniel in this way. You're truly a pillar of support for our families." He read it twice. The words looked kind, but they carried the quiet sting of someone who believed she was doing him a favor by letting him contribute. Magnus folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside his bed, the same drawer where Diane's picture rested. For a moment he stared at both side by side, the past that left and the present that took. He sighed. "You'd laugh at this, Dee," he whispered. "They call it honoring me. But I'm just the man paying the bill." As the wedding date approached, every conversation carried that polished tone, polite, professional, and subtly dismissive. The Reeds thanked him endlessly, but not once did anyone ask how he was managing it all. The night before the final deposit was due, Magnus sat with his checkbook open. His hands were steady but his chest was tight. He thought about his father, a man who worked until his back gave out, who never had enough to give but gave anyway. Magnus signed the check, tore it carefully, and whispered to himself, "For love, not pride." He slipped it into the envelope and sealed it shut. Somewhere deep down he knew the truth. Money could buy him a seat at the table, but not the kind of respect that should have come with it. Still, he told himself the same thing he always did. You keep giving even when they stop seeing you. Because that's what fathers do. And as the night sank into silence, Magnus leaned back, eyes closed, hands still smelling faintly of ink and steel. He'd worked his whole life to build something that mattered, and now he was paying to belong in a place that still didn't see him. The morning broke soft and bright, the kind of light that flatters everything it touches. The vineyard shimmered like a postcard, rows of green stitched neatly under a sky the color of new silk. Guests arrived in slow waves. Linen suits, pastel dresses, gold watches that caught the sun and threw it back like confetti. Magnus parked far from the entrance, by the gravel slope near the service vans. The main lot was full, or so the attendant told him, smiling apologetically. He didn't argue. He just nodded, took his jacket from the back seat, and began the quiet walk toward the grand building where his son was getting married. He'd bought a new suit for the day. Dark navy. Subtle sheen. The tailor had said it made him look sharp but humble. "You like that?" It fit the man he'd always tried to be. As he reached the front steps, two young attendants stood beside the glass doors, greeting guests with soft smiles and glossy programs. One of them glanced at Magnus' invitation, frowned politely, and said, "Ah, sir, the family entrance is around the side. You'll find it quicker through there." "Family entrance?" Magnus asked, voice low. "Yes, sir. Staff will guide you." He hesitated, then followed their direction. Around the side, past the scent of cut flowers and the hum of air conditioners, he found a narrow walkway leading to a plain metal door. A woman in black slacks and a headset smiled at him briskly. "You must be Mr. Gray," she said. "Right this way." He followed her through the corridors, past the kitchen, where cooks rushed with trays of salmon and champagne glasses, and past the storage area where crates of wine sat stacked against the wall. The air smelled of heat, garlic, and nerves. Finally, she stopped at a small corner near the service door. A single folding chair waited there, tucked beside a table of linens. "Please wait here until you're called," she said. Magnus frowned. "Called for what?" "Oh, the coordinator will bring you out when it's time for photos or the blessing, depending on what's been scheduled." She gave him a kind smile, the kind reserved for guests who didn't quite belong, then disappeared down the hall. Magnus sat down. The chair creaked. From where he sat, he could hear the music start, strings and soft laughter carried faintly through the door. He could picture it, Daniel standing tall in his tuxedo, Emily glowing in her gown. The crowd watching. The cameras flashing. He smiled despite himself. That was his boy. A waiter hurried by, nearly bumping his shoulder. "Sorry, sir." "It's all right," Magnus murmured. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the program one of the attendants had finally handed him at the side door. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing the glossy paper across his lap. The names gleamed in gold foil, the union of Emily Josephine Reed and Daniel Elijah Gray. Below were the family lists. Parents of the bride, Judge Robert and Mrs. Josephine Reed. Parents of the groom. Magnus' eyes moved down the page. There was a pause, a decorative flourish, then, "In loving memory of Diane Harper Gray." That was it. No mention of him. No acknowledgement. Just Diane, gone for years, and a silence where his name should have been. He read it again, slower this time. The gold letters shimmered slightly as if mocking him. For a long time he didn't move. Then he folded the program once, then twice, and placed it back in his pocket. His hands were steady but his chest felt hollow. A burst of applause echoed from the hall. The ceremony had begun. Through the thin crack of the service door, Magnus caught glimpses, flashes of gold and glass, the glint of chandeliers, people leaning forward in their chairs, phones raised to capture the moment. He could hear the pastor's voice faintly, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Josephine's voice carried back, clear and sure. "Her father and I do." Silence. Then soft laughter, applause, music swelling. Magnus closed his eyes. When the vows came he couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of Daniel's voice, firm and trembling, followed by Emily's, light as air. He sat through it all, through the cheers, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of guests moving from one hall to another. Every sound came to him muted, filtered, as if he were underwater watching another world move above him. After a while, a young server appeared, balancing a tray of half-empty champagne flutes. She looked at him curiously. "Sir, are you supposed to be in the kitchen?" Magnus smiled faintly. "Seems like I am." The girl hesitated, then offered him a glass. "You can take one if you like. No one'll notice." He nodded his thanks and took it. The champagne fizzed softly, catching a shard of sunlight from the narrow window. He raised it slightly, not a toast, not really, just a gesture to the air, and whispered, "To you, boy. To everything you became." For a moment he almost believed he belonged. But then the laughter came again, this time louder, fuller, from just beyond the door. He could hear Daniel's voice, happy and alive, calling someone Mom. And that was when it broke. Not in a dramatic way, not the kind of breaking that shouts. It was quiet. A slow, invisible cracking from the inside out. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the back exit. The sun outside was blinding, sharp against the metal door. He blinked, breathing slow, steady. He could have stayed. Could have waited for someone to remember him, to call him out for pictures, to say, "That's the groom's father, you know." But no one did. As he stepped out, the vineyard hummed behind him. Laughter, music, glasses clinking. A world of gold and glass, polished and untouchable. He walked past the rows of parked cars, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. Somewhere far behind him, a cheer went up, the kind that follows a kiss. He smiled sadly. "That's my boy," he whispered. At the edge of the lot, he paused and looked back once. The building glowed in the late afternoon sun, radiant and perfect, as if it had never held a man like him inside. Magnus slipped his hands into his pockets and kept walking. The folded program pressed against his chest, a quiet reminder of where he wasn't. And for the first time in his life he felt what it truly meant to disappear while still being alive. Morning came slow and gray, like the sky itself was nursing a hangover from the wedding's excess. Magnus sat at his small kitchen table, still in the suit from the day before. The jacket hung loose on his shoulders, the fabric creased from the long drive home. On the table before him lay a stack of envelopes, receipts, and printed invoices, all the things he'd been told were necessary for tradition. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't mind. He wasn't really drinking it. For a long time he just sat there, staring at the paper. The wedding had cost him more than he wanted to admit, not just in money but in pride. Every payment had felt like a slow trade, his worth for their approval. And now that the show was over, all he had left was silence. He reached for the top envelope, the one from the event planner. The letterhead gleamed gold. Reed and Company. Weddings. He opened it carefully, unfolded the invoice, and saw the remaining balance circled in red, $12,450. Due upon final processing. He read it twice. Then he reached for his pen and drew a single line straight through the number. No anger. No curse. Just a quiet decision. He moved to the next invoice, catering, floral design, venue rental, and did the same. With each stroke of his pen, his breathing steadied. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. When he was done, he gathered all the papers neatly, clipped them together, and slid them into a red folder. The same red folder Diane used to keep their household bills in back when she was still around. Funny how the smallest things outlasted people. Magnus stood and walked to his desk. He pulled out his checkbook, the one he'd kept for years, pages curling at the corners. He opened to the last entry, wrote one final check. Not to the vendors, not to the Reeds, but to himself. A reimbursement for his dignity. In the memo line he wrote, "For peace owed." He tore it out, placed it atop the red folder, and took a picture with his phone. The shot was simple. No filters, no framing, just a man's quiet ending to a loud humiliation. He opened his social media account. It had been months since he'd last posted. The last time was Daniel's college graduation. He'd written a long caption back then full of pride and hope. This time he said nothing. He uploaded the picture of the check in the folder. No tags, no words. Just the image. Then he pressed post. The screen dimmed. A small gray circle spun for a second, then stopped. It was done. Outside, a soft drizzle began to fall. Magnus stepped out onto the porch and watched it. The earth smelled clean, like it was rinsing itself of yesterday. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint hum of cars moving along the highway, people rushing toward something as always. He wasn't rushing anymore. His phone buzzed once. A message from a vendor. "Mr. Jackson, just confirming, are we still clear to process payment?" He replied simply, "No. The balance is canceled. You've been paid enough." Another buzz. The photographer this time. "Sir, we still need the final deposit for the albums." Magnus typed, "There will be no album. Keep the photos." He turned the phone over, face down, and let the rain's rhythm fill the silence. Later that afternoon he went to the bank. The teller, a young woman who knew him by name, smiled when she saw him. "Afternoon, Mr. Jackson. You here to make a deposit?" He handed her a withdrawal slip instead. "Just moving some things around." She processed it quickly, polite and unaware of what that money meant. How many years of saving, how many nights of overtime, how many birthdays missed so a boy could stand tall in a suit his father paid for. When she handed back the receipt, Magnus nodded, folded it into his wallet and said, "Thank you." Outside the bank, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, pale, almost shy about it. He walked down the street toward the diner where he sometimes had lunch on Sundays. The waitress saw him through the window and waved. He smiled back. He sat at his usual booth, ordered his usual, black coffee, catfish sandwich, no fries. The simple meal of a man who didn't need much to feel full. As he waited, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a vendor. It was Daniel. The text was short. "Dad, what's this post about?" Magnus stared at the screen. He thought about replying, about explaining everything, about reminding him that love doesn't mean servitude. But then he remembered something Diane once said back when things were simpler. Sometimes silence says what pride cannot. He placed the phone beside his plate, screen down. The coffee arrived, steaming. He took a sip, hot, bitter, real. For the first time in a long while, it didn't taste like exhaustion. It tasted like choice. Around him, the diner buzzed with quiet life. People laughing, plates clinking, the hum of ordinary joy. No one knew who he was, what he'd done, or what he'd walked away from. And that anonymity, that small invisibility, felt good this time. He didn't need to be seen anymore. By the time he finished eating, the clouds had fully parted. Sunlight spilled across the table, catching the rim of his coffee cup. He watched it for a while, letting the warmth hit his hands. Somewhere out there, people were talking. Maybe about the wedding. Maybe about the man who posted a picture without words. Maybe about nothing at all. Magnus smiled faintly. Let them. He'd spent a lifetime earning the right to be silent, and now, finally, he was cashing it in. He stood, paid his bill, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind that makes you breathe deeper without knowing why. As he walked toward his truck, the last of the puddles reflected the sky. He looked down and saw his own face in the water, older, lined, but at peace. He didn't look away. Magnus Jackson, the man who built quietly, gave quietly, and was forgotten quietly, had finally done something loud without saying a word. And for the first time in years, silence didn't feel empty. It felt like freedom. Daniel arrived before noon, tires crunching over the gravel driveway like an unwelcome drumbeat. The air was thick with southern heat, the kind that sits heavy, daring you to breathe wrong. Magnus watched from the porch, unmoving, his coffee untouched. He'd known this visit was coming. He could feel it in his bones the moment he posted that photo. Daniel stepped out of his car, dressed sharp as always, pressed slacks, cufflinks, wristwatch glinting in the light. His face, though, told a different story. Red around the eyes. Tension in the jaw. Pride trying hard to cover confusion. "Dad," he started, voice tight. "What was that post about?" Magnus didn't answer right away. He gestured instead toward the porch chair beside him. "Sit, son." "I'm not sitting." Daniel's tone cut sharp, impatient. "People are calling. Emily's parents are calling. They said you embarrassed them, embarrassed me." Magnus looked at him then, really looked. The boy he'd raised had vanished somewhere behind the suit and the polished anger. The man standing before him was someone he barely recognized. "I didn't embarrass you," Magnus said quietly. "I just stopped paying for people who already spent me." Daniel exhaled hard, rubbing the back of his neck. You could have talked to me first. We could have handled this privately. Magnus nodded slowly. Privately? Like how you handled my seat at your wedding. Daniel's eyes flickered, guilt flashing before he caught it. It wasn't like that. Emily just thought. Emily thought I didn't fit, Magnus interrupted, his tone calm but firm. Didn't match the decor. Didn't suit the theme. I paid for that theme, Daniel. I bought the chair I wasn't allowed to sit in. Silence settled between them, not empty, but loud with everything neither had said for years. Magnus rose from his seat and walked inside. Daniel stood there, hands on his hips, eyes darting toward the house, maybe thinking of leaving. But he didn't. He waited. A few seconds later, Magnus returned with the red folder. He held it carefully as if it contained something fragile, which in a way it did. He placed it on the porch table. What's that? Daniel asked. Your mother's truth, Magnus said. And mine. Daniel frowned, confused. I don't understand. Magnus didn't answer. He just nudged the folder toward him. Daniel hesitated, then opened it. Inside were the two letters, Diane's handwriting unmistakable, still graceful even after all these years. He unfolded the first page. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the words. The more he read, the tighter his hands gripped the paper. When he looked up, his face was pale, almost drained. This isn't real. Magnus said nothing. She said I wasn't, Daniel's voice cracked. That Michael Reed, that. Magnus' gaze didn't waver. She told the truth the way she should have years ago. I didn't want you to find out like this. But maybe it's the only way you'd ever listen. Daniel dropped the letter onto the table, shaking his head. You knew? You knew all this time? I knew. And you didn't say anything? Magnus' voice softened. Because you were my son. You still are. Blood don't change the years, Daniel. It don't rewrite who woke up at 4 a.m. to pack your lunch. Who held you when your fever wouldn't break. Who prayed over you when you went off to college. Daniel's jaw clenched. You should have told me. You should have. Magnus cut him off, calm but final. Told you what? That the man you became, the one I worked my hands to the bone for, was built on a lie I didn't choose? What good would that have done? I didn't need to tell you were mine. I lived it. Daniel stepped back, voice shaking now. So what now? You want me to hate her? You want me to hate you? Magnus shook his head. I don't want hate. I just want peace. He picked up the second letter, unfolded it, and placed it before Daniel. That one's from your real father. Read it. Daniel hesitated, then obeyed. His lips moved silently as he read. Michael's confession, his guilt, his apology, his claim. When he reached the end, he looked up, eyes wet. So all this time, he whispered. All this time I looked down on you. On where I came from. And I didn't even know who I was. Magnus' expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes. Sadness, not anger. Now you do. Daniel's breathing was shallow. I didn't mean to treat you that way. I just... Magnus raised a hand gently. You don't have to explain. You wanted a new family, Daniel. Now you can have it. The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, final. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came. He looked down at the letters again, then at the man before him. The distance between them felt wider than ever, not just in space but in understanding. Magnus turned away, walking to the porch rail. He looked out toward the yard, where the sun had begun to lower behind the trees. I loved your mother even after she left. I loved you even when you didn't see me. But I can't keep loving people who only come around when it's convenient. Daniel swallowed hard. Dad. Magnus turned back to him, his face calm, eyes steady. No. Don't call me that right now. Not until you understand what the word means. Daniel's throat tightened. What do you want me to do? Leave the folder, Magnus said. It belongs here. The truth always does. Daniel stood still for a long time, eyes wet, jaw trembling. Then, slowly, he placed the letters back into the folder and slid it across the table. He turned to leave, hesitated once more at the steps and said quietly, I didn't mean to erase you. Magnus nodded. But you did. Daniel looked down, then walked to his car. The gravel crunched again, softer now, almost regretful. Magnus didn't watch him drive away. He didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't happen with words, they happen with silence. He sat back in his chair, the folder resting on the table beside his coffee. The cup had gone cold again. He didn't mind. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the Tennessee hills. The sky darkened, but Magnus felt no fear. He'd weathered storms far worse than this, and now, finally, the truth had cleared the air. He looked at the folder one last time, then closed it. It was finished. The first thing Magnus noticed that morning wasn't the sound of the clock or the hum of his old refrigerator. It was the smell of roses. The red ones by the porch had finally bloomed, full, open, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. He leaned on the railing, coffee mug in hand, and watched the petals catch the early sun. Peace didn't come with noise. It came with mornings like this, quiet, unhurried, honest. Before we go further, where are you watching from? And tell me, have you ever had to rebuild your peace after losing everything you thought you needed? The breeze rolled gently through the yard, carrying the faint sound of laughter from down the street. It was Saturday, neighborhood cookout day. The kind of gathering that didn't need invitations or dress codes. Just good food, loud talk, and people who understood the language of simple living. Magnus didn't used to go to things like that. Not for lack of invitation, but because he'd always been too tired, too proud, too used to working instead of living. But today was different. He set his cup down, buttoned his shirt, and walked down the porch steps with a small, steady smile. The cookout was held in Mr. Henderson's backyard, the retired postman who'd lived 2 houses down since Magnus bought his place 30 years ago. The smell of ribs, corn, and charcoal filled the air. Kids ran barefoot through sprinklers, and an old radio played Otis Redding through static and laughter. Magnus, Claire called, waving a paper plate in one hand. She was his neighbor across the street, retired nurse, sharp tongue, soft heart. We were just talking about you. You finally decided to show up before the food gone? Magnus chuckled, shaking his head. Couldn't let y'all eat up everything without me. Too late, Mr. Henderson said from behind the grill, flipping a slab of ribs. You lucky I saved you some. He handed Magnus a plate, ribs, potato salad, cornbread. Here. For the man who finally learned to sit still. Magnus smiled, grateful. He found a seat near the edge of the yard, under the shade of a pecan tree. Around him, people talked, argued good-naturedly, passed drinks, and laughed the kind of laugh that fills a man's chest, not just his ears. It had been weeks since the confrontation. Weeks since Daniel left with nothing but silence trailing behind him. There'd been no calls, no letters, no apologies. Just stillness. And strangely, that stillness didn't hurt anymore. It healed. Magnus hadn't told anyone about the letters or the wedding. He didn't need to. Some stories don't need retelling to find closure. They just need living beyond them. Across the yard, Claire stood to make a toast. She clinked her plastic cup with a spoon until the chatter quieted. All right now, she said. Before y'all go back to eating and arguing over football, I just want to say something. She turned toward Magnus, smiling. To our brother here. The man who's been working, giving, helping, and never asking for anything back. Took him a long time to figure out that it's okay to choose himself sometimes. So tonight we celebrate that. Everyone raised their cups. To Magnus. Magnus raised his too, a little shyly. To those who've been invisible too long, he said, his voice deep but warm. May you all remember, you can't pour from an empty cup. Laughter rippled through the group, followed by clinking cups and another song playing from the radio. It was an old Sam Cooke tune this time, one Magnus hadn't heard since Diane used to hum it while doing dishes. He didn't feel bitterness anymore. Just a soft ache, the kind that reminded him he was still alive. After a while, as the evening settled into gold and smoke, Claire joined him under the tree. You look lighter, she said. Maybe I am, Magnus replied. For the first time in a long while. She nodded. You ever think about reaching out to your boy? Magnus thought about it. Then he shook his head gently. When he's ready to see me, not what I gave him, I'll be here. Until then, I got peace to tend to. Claire smiled. Peace looks good on you, Magnus. He smiled back and they sat quietly watching the sky shift colors above the trees. As the night came, the crowd thinned. Mr. Henderson packed up the grill, kids chased fireflies, and the music turned soft, old blues humming through the dark. Magnus stayed behind to help fold chairs, then started his walk home under the streetlights. The town felt different now, not because it had changed but because he had. He saw faces he used to pass without noticing. Heard laughter that used to fade into background noise. Every small thing felt alive, connected. When he reached his porch, the roses were glowing under the lamplight, rich and red. He knelt down, ran a calloused hand over one bloom and smiled. It had survived the frost, the storms, the neglect, all of it. It had bloomed anyway. Inside, he washed his hands, poured a glass of sweet tea and sat by the window. The old house creaked softly, the kind of sound that used to make him feel alone but now felt like company. He looked around, The framed photos, the worn furniture, the tools by the door. Nothing about his life was glamorous. But it was his. Every inch of it. Paid for not just with money but with time, sweat, forgiveness. On the table beside him lay the red folder. He hadn't opened it since that day. He didn't plan to. Some truths, once faced, don't need revisiting. Instead, he placed his palm over it and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to let go." Then he stood, walked back outside and sat on the porch again. The sky was clear, full of stars you only saw if you stopped looking down. Magnus leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. The air smelled like roses and summer rain. He closed his eyes and breathed deep. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like the absence of love. It felt like its proof. Love that didn't demand, didn't beg, didn't break. Love that simply existed, steady as the earth beneath his boots. He thought about everything he'd lost, and realized he hadn't lost anything that was truly his. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, long, low, and fading. Magnus smiled to himself. "Let it go," he whispered. Then, with his hands resting easy on his lap, he watched the roses move gently in the night breeze, a soft dance of red and shadow, of blood and bloom, of endings that looked a lot like beginnings. "Before we end, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever learned, maybe the hard way, that peace starts when you finally choose yourself?" Magnus Jackson had. And for him that was enough. The camera would fade out here, slow, deliberate, leaving him on that porch, surrounded by red roses in full bloom. Not waiting for anyone. Not proving anything. Just being. A man who finally chose himself.